Our final speaker is Keith Conradi, who is the Chief Investigator of the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch. Keith's been an RAF pilot, a civilian pilot, and then laterally taken a huge interest in improving safety in the aviation industry. And I was involved with the Secretary of State who set up HSIB was Jeremy Hunt. He was certainly passionate about patient safety, irrespective of whether you agree with his politics. And I and Matthew Syed, a Times journalist, and Norman Williams, then President of the College of Surgeons, were meeting with Jeremy Hunt and trying to bring to healthcare what we saw in aviation. And it was quite clear Keith Conradi was the person to be the first person in that role. So we're delighted to have Keith on possibly his final role to speak to us today. Keith, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. I seem to spend my life trying not to talk about aviation these days because I know how difficult that can be. But thank you for that introduction. And I have to say also to Glenn, helicopters, 60,000 feet. I'm afraid that's Concorde territory. Nothing else goes up there. So good morning, everybody. And I'm going to speak about the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch. I did have a brief. You'll forgive me if I slightly vary from that brief over the next 20 minutes or so. But what I will talk about is its current status. We have some pretty interesting future plans over the next year or so. And I'll then briefly speak about the expanding role beyond pure investigations. But I'd quite like to concentrate on some of my reflections, having spent 5 years coming in as a non-clinician into this environment. So if you would bear with me, that's the plan for the next 20 minutes or so. Just for those who may not be so familiar with us, the Healthcare Safety Investigation Branch was set up about 5 years ago. We have two arms. We have a national arm. It does about 25 investigations a year. To date, we've completed 61, and they're sort of fairly large thematic type reports. We make on average about 3 safety recommendations per report. We've deliberately kept that quite low. We know the system's got an awful lot of things that are thrown at it, and we didn't want to add to that except where, and I'll come back to this a lot, where the evidence really gave us that opportunity. We also do make safety observations, things that we see, and we like to report on safety action that gets taken as a result of doing the investigation. That's kind of a win-win. We do have another arm which was landed on us, if I can use that phrase, about a year after we started. So we're just getting going with one, and we were asked to do maternity investigations. These are slightly different. They're at a much larger scale, and in this area, if certain events happen, we actually do the investigation instead of the local trust investigation. And it's the best part of 1,000 investigations a year. We've completed 2,500 to date. And we are pretty much, well, we are in every maternity unit across England. And I should say HSIB only operates in England. So that's the current status, but things, they are changing. And from about a year's time, the HSIB will become the Health Services Safety Investigations Body, HSIB. My IT guys are pretty unhappy about that, having to change the branding by adding an extra S in there, but so be it. So that will take the national investigations, so that's the part that does about 25 big investigations a year. And at the same time, the maternity program will continue. And there were quite a few doubts about this, but we're delighted that it will continue for up to 5 years as a special health authority. And there will be secondary legislation that should be up and about this summer to bring that into effect. So there's going to be this split in about a year's time. So I will also mention the Health and Care Bill. we play a small, but I'd like to think quite significant part of this. In part 4 of this large bill, it talks about the setting up of the Health Services Safety Investigations Body. And I feel that the whole time I have been here, I have been lobbying to put the investigation body on a statutory footing. So I'm really, really pleased about this. And it will give extensive powers to the new organisation, which I think are needed. Even though I'd like to think we've been fairly successful over the last few years, there are still many examples where people won't speak to us, and we have no power, so people don't have to, or we can't access data, evidence. We have sometimes had difficulties in getting consent to look at medical records. All of these things we will have the power to do, and to do it in a timely fashion. And if there's one thing about investigations, particularly when you do a lot of interviews, the timeliness of those interviews is really critical to the quality of the information you're going to get. So we're pleased about that. There is also this area that when we take interviews and statements from people, we want to be able to protect that information from being used for other purposes. It's been quite controversial. It does work well in all the transport sectors, and I know that is part of some of the debate that's going on right now as we get to the sort of final pieces of this particular bill. But I really hope that that goes through. So that's pretty exciting territory for us right now and for my successor. One of the areas we do, in addition to pure investigations, is education on safety investigations. And this was put in our sort of remit from the start, but we felt that very much we needed to mature our own style of doing safety investigations before we really could then start to talk about how to do it to other people. I think it might have been rather arrogant to have gone off straight from the get-go in doing that. But we now have an education team made up a mixture of investigators and some safety scientists. They have designed a program and are rolling it out. And at the moment, there are about 300 trust-level investigators who are going through this program. And we really do think, perhaps more than anything else, this is where we might make some of that cultural change at a scale that we can't do with just 20 or so investigations a year. And by the end of this calendar year, we expect to have put about 1,000 people through this program. And in addition to training the trust investigators, we have a separate course, and it's only half a day, but this is targeted at the senior decision makers in trusts. And we think it's really important to balance the output of a safety investigation with those that may have or do have the ability to make decisions on the recommendations that are put, even at local trust level. And what we really want is that the decision makers recognize that actually just getting rid of the last person who happened to be there when a particular tragedy happened, just moving them on or getting rid of them is not really hardly ever the answer. And we want to be able to show that that bigger picture is seen throughout the organisation, which is effectively what we do, but more on the national scale. So those are the current courses going through. The Health and Care Bill will put that into legislation as well. It will require us to provide guidance, advice, and training to the NHS, which again is really, really pleasing. And in fact, it goes beyond that, and it gives us an opportunity to actually talk more widely, to take this to a sort of a global scale. And again, I think that's really important because the learning that takes place, we're starting to join some of that up, I'd like to think, within England, but actually why stop there? Because the learning on how to do quality safety investigations can actually be the same throughout the world. There are very few countries that currently have a state-based safety investigation body. It tends to be Scandinavia. Norway has legislation already in place. but I think everybody could benefit from having these much more widely placed. So I've kind of cantered through that fairly quickly because I really wanted to talk about some of the things that I've seen, kind of good and bad really, across the piece. So first of all, I think one of the things that has been successful is staff and family engagement. I think for any staff member who has been at the front line of a tragic event, knowing that there's going to be investigation is always going to be an incredibly stressful and anxious time. And I can speak from personal experience in that I once landed one of my aircraft and went off the end of the runway and was caught in this big barrier. And I couldn't get out because the barrier's all over the top, so I couldn't use the ejection system. There's a huge fuel leak pouring out. I've got my engine, which is, I can't shut down. The plane's in several pieces. And I'm sat there, and I really should have been worrying about what might happen next. But all I could think about was, there's going to be an investigation, I'm going to lose my license, career over. And I was sat there for ages until the fireman got me out, just thinking about that sort of scenario. So whenever we go in to do an investigation, we really take the time to speak to those involved and help them, I think, understand just what we are trying to bring to the party. And it is, we don't apportion blame or liability. We try to understand why somebody came to work that day planning to do a really, really good job, and circumstances transpired that led to a tragedy happening. And we're always pushing ourselves to see the bigger picture. And the feedback we have from staff is that it often can be quite a cathartic experience. Nobody's looking forward to it, but by the time we've finished, it actually has often really helped the individuals actually sometimes move on. So I think that is a good thing. Families are always at the centre of our investigations. We always give a family the opportunity to speak to us, should they want to. They don't always want to. But the engagement level runs around about 89–90%. And I think families, patients and families who may have sat by a bedside for a long period of time are often some of the very best witnesses we can get. And they gave a tremendous insight sometimes into the culture of what has been happening in that particular setting. Often they have very little else to do, those who've been sitting perhaps by a bedside, and we get great quality evidence from some of these interviews. In terms of the professional approach, we use a methodology here. It's SEEPS, it's a System Engineering Initiative for Patient Safety. It doesn't really matter the words, but what we do is we think about a person who is trying to do a task with tools in an environment, in a regulatory framework. And we try and look at all of those interactions to try and understand and help us in a sort of fairly systematic way understand how we can put recommendations together to improving that and trying to prevent it happening again. We stand independently. I say that with a slight smile on my face because we've been hosted by NHS England or Improvement over the last few years, and that I don't think has always helped. And the independence that the Health and Care Bill will enshrine is hugely, hugely important. But we do try and sit separately, and the key thing to this is we are not a regulator. And we don't mandate anything. We write a report and we make safety recommendations, and that's it. And people say, what are we expert at? We are only expert at carrying out investigations, nothing else. And impartiality goes hand in hand with that. We have selected a wide range of backgrounds for our investigators. Many are clinical, but many deliberately are not. Many come from a safety investigation background in other sectors. Some come from we've got some ex-policemen. I know I can't believe it myself, but it does work. It does work. And we have psychologists, human factors experts. And when we do an investigation, we try and combine a team. It's usually about 3, and they all see different things, and they all ask different questions. And I think that is incredibly healthy. And what I say is, and this particularly applies to the national side, is we don't have an opinion. And that's been quite hard to get that message over. We look at the evidence, we look at guidance, we look at the regulations, but we question everything to try and understand why something happened. We usually get fairly quickly to what happened, but it's the why. Why did this happen, and what can we do about it? The other thing, sat as a national body as opposed to the individual trust investigations, is that mostly, even though these are events that people know about, they're not really, really common. And so it's quite difficult for individual trust investigations sometimes to be joined up. And I like to think we are in a position to be able to do that. So we look at the databases and we pick and choose investigations that we see happening across the country. And crucially, one of the things we've done is also the responses to our safety recommendations, where somebody has said, look, this is what we're going to do about this. And I'm talking about the maternity cases where we do 1,000. We've tried to share those as a newsletter across the country. So we're not saying this is the answer, but everybody can read, okay, this is what the trust in Penzance did when they had that problem. And when you're up in Newcastle, you can see the same thing. And it's just a way of giving people some information to decide, actually, might that work for you? But ultimately, we don't say that. As I say, we're not a regulator. Cultural change. You know, when I came across, I heard about the punitive regime that seemed to exist when people made mistakes. And we absolutely set ourselves up that we don't apportion that blame. We don't blame individuals. But we do need to have an escalation policy. And sometimes when we're doing investigations, we will see things that concern us. And we are required and will be required in the new law to actually escalate those to the appropriate authorities. And I think that's right. Again, that's mirrored in other sectors. To date, we've hardly ever had to do that. I can think of about 3 occasions where we've needed to escalate. Usually escalate within a trust, and we give the bare information necessary for the trust to be able to take appropriate action. Probably the one that has been most useful, perhaps, or most certainly publicised, was the maternity investigations we did at East Kent. And we were making recommendations. We were going back in, doing further events, and we weren't seeing that action take place. And we escalated to the trust, we escalated then further to CQC, and action was then taken. And the rather nice sort of, I don't know if it's an ending, but sort of the continuation of that story is that recently East Kent came to us and said, actually, we really would like to put our trust level investigators through one of your courses. And we actually put together a bespoke investigation course, which they went through last year. So I thought that was pretty positive. A word on safety recommendations. Safety recommendations are a major part of our output, and we don't make them lightly. And there's a lot of work to do, I still think, with the responses to safety recommendations. But I just wanted to speak about the hierarchy, because I think this comes into along the lines of companies, and the likes of GS1 can have some impact here. There's a lot of papers on how do you make an effective safety recommendation. And right at the bottom, the least effective safety recommendations are those that involve training, or as we sometimes say, thickening the rule book. and it is widely known that they really have limited effectiveness. The right at the top are what we would call forcing functions or automation, when you take the human liability or likelihood to err as much out of the loop as possible. And that, so we always try to push ourselves for how can we recommend something that fits right at that top level. And I'll come into one in a second. So I was asked to talk a little bit about never events. And so we did do this report. So this was a sort of a collection, a thematic look at some of our first investigations, and surprise, surprise, many of these were into never events. And one of the things about a never event is that it shouldn't happen because it has a strong and systemic barrier that would prevent people or these events actually happening at all. When we looked at these, we found that that just wasn't the case. And for many of these events, these barriers weren't in place. And I just go back to what I think it might have even been our very first investigation, which was into a wrong prosthesis. It was a total hip replacement when 2 incompatible parts were put into a person. And what happened, I mean, there were a variety of reasons why that occurred, but the barcoding, the scanning into the National Joint Registry, which didn't happen until a couple of days later, and it was then that the alarm was set off in the National Joint Registry to say, oh, hang on a sec, these parts are incompatible, by which stage the chap was off and at home. And we looked around and we saw that actually a number of places, particularly overseas, the scanning takes place in the operating theatre at the time. And so that was a fairly straightforward recommendation for us. Again, it doesn't take the human out of the loop completely, but it does give that alert, and we think provides a stronger barrier and potentially could help with that situation. It's quite personal. I had my hip done about 4 months ago, so I have to say I was pretty keen to talk to the surgeon about this and make absolutely sure that wasn't going to happen to me. As far as I know, it hasn't, so that's good. So that was important. After the end of this National Learning Report, we made a recommendation to NHS England that they revise the list to really include those with strong and systemic barriers. The response was interesting. They agreed with us that the list needed revision, but they really couldn't think of strong and systemic barriers that could be put in place to, if you like, to put events back on the list. And they said to us, could you think of any? Which really isn't our role. We're not experts in that. We're experts in identifying some of the reasons behind it. But I add that in because I think there is technology, I think there is automation, I think there are forcing areas. And I would recommend perhaps if you want to beat a path to the door there, they are still absolutely open for looking at ways in which this can be improved in that respect. Safety recommendations themselves, yes, we've had not a bad response. Overall, about 80% of our safety recommendations are accepted, and they're fairly slow burn. I think people think that, think changes are going to happen overnight with these. That just isn't the way it really works. A lot of it is about putting together groups and slowly working through things. And often when we put a safety recommendation about something to happen, we say, and it should be evaluated along with best practice, human factors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's really important as opposed to a quick knee-jerk fix. We do need a place to escalate what we might consider no response or very weak responses. And we've been battling for a while with this. There has been now set up a National Patient Safety Committee, which I think is going to provide a place where we can actually escalate poor, weak responses. And we do this all publicly. So we publish the reports, we publish the safety recommendations, and we publish the responses. And I push back against mandating them, but I think it's important to put it into the public domain and, if you like, almost force it into more of a public debate. Things that I've seen that haven't worked so well, the regulatory landscape. It was quite surprising to me just how many bodies can have a regulatory impact in healthcare. Carl McRae, one of the academics who was part of the establishment of us, did a paper on it, and it's well over 100 bodies can have this impact and can regulate. I see lots of guidance. I don't see much hard regulation. I see, and the frustration for us is when we put a safety recommendation out to a body, they go, it's not for us, it's for those people over there, and those people over there go, it's not for us, it's for those people over there. And I have had emails bouncing backwards and forwards between some of the biggest regulators not wanting to actually take leadership of this, and I think that's sometimes pretty disappointing. So the other side of it is that with so many regulators, we often get conflicting regulation or guidance that goes out there, and we've put several recommendations out to say, hey, come on guys, get together, can you just have one set so that people can run with one particular set of process. Safety leadership, and we may come on to this in the chat later on, but I really would like to see more at board level. I would love to see non-exec director on every board with a responsibility to challenge everything from a safety perspective. It's something that does happen in other sectors, and I think that would be helpful, and I think it does need chief execs to actually take a huge interest in this. If I can just talk about aviation, 1 second please, forgive me, but during my time there, EasyJet had one of the best safety records in the UK. At the time, their chief exec, Carolyn McCall, she took a personal interest on all the safety incidents that happened. She sat on the safety committees below board level, and she really made a difference, in my opinion, to the success of that particular airline. I think it's the final thing I've got here. I think one of the things we can do better in the future is to put more into our national reports that local trusts can use. Most of our recommendations, in fact nearly all of them, go to the national bodies, and we do constantly get feedback. What's in it for us? We want to make a difference. What can we do? And so we're just experimenting now with different things. Again, not telling people, but giving some observations that we may have seen as we go up and down the country, looking at ways to prevent certain things happening. And really finally, I just wanted to say, personally, I am leaving in a couple of months. I wanted to thank everybody who's been supportive of this different style of investigation. And I really hope you can offer the same support and encouragement to my successor. Thank you very much indeed.